previously from last class lecture, which I think was last Thursday, I had, of course, started talking about the English Civil War. And let me pull up a slide here for you. Take a look at that. I think we're kind of up to the point where it just broke out. So I think we were up to like 1642. Charles I, of course, caused the outbreak of course, English Civil War. They think in January of 1642. And you have a case where Parliament and the Royalist side kind of split in England. And you get these two opposing sides that emerge on both sides. You've got on one side, you've got what they call the Cavaliers, which are called the Royalists. Royalists is the common name they call them, and then Cavalier is more the nickname that they called them. Then the Parliamentarian side, they had the Roundheads. And you can see both sides had different kind of supporters. The Royalist side, of course, had most of the nobility and the king on their side. A lot of the wealthy landowners were involved. Members of the Anglican Church, also Catholics were, pro-Catholics were also in support of the Royalist Cavalier side as well. The Cavaliers were known for their, you can see on the bottom, they were known for their long shoulder length hair. A lot of them were Catholic or Anglican. The Roundheads were mostly parliamentarian supporters. They were called Roundheads due to their helmets they wore in battle. A lot of them were more like less wealthier people, small landowners. You can see town-dwelling manufacturers, a lot of the peasants. And then people that were Puritan, of course, were, on their side. And of course, they would have several generals that would be famous later, like Oliver Cromwell, like you, of course, saw, of course, in that short video a little second ago. Now, the conflict itself would rage for several years with the so-called First English Civil War. So you got your two dividing sides, parliamentarian side versus the Royalist side overall. The Roundheads had different officers that ran what would later be the so-called New Model Army, that they would call it. And the two most famous generals that were under the parliamentarian side or Roundhead side was Oliver Cromwell, who was not actually in command of the forces. They had another general named Sir Thomas Fairfax. Fairfax was actually the top general, who was the head of the later so-called New Model Army, which I'll get to in a second. But Cromwell, as the war went, became really more successful, more famous. And Cromwell was called different nicknames. He was sometimes called Old Ironsides, or they also called him Puritan Moses. He was very, very religious, big Puritan, Oliver Cromwell. And Cromwell had been originally a member of Parliament. He's actually related back to, I think, Thomas Cromwell, who had been like a minister under Henry VIII. So he kind of had a lineage that went back to previous monarchs in power. But he became more well known as a soldier during the war. And Cromwell was more or less known for leading cavalry under Sir Thomas Fairfax. He had a cavalry unit that was called the Ironsides, and it was one of the best cavalry units in the parliamentarian armies. By 1645, one of the key things that really is the reason why the parliamentarian side won was they developed a more better army that was called the New Model Army. You can see it was established in 1645. And this was actually considered one of England's first major professional armies that was organized. And it was like a type of army that fought everywhere, not just in England, but it fought in Scotland, later even invaded Ireland with it as well. And it allowed Cromwell to eventually consolidate his power throughout all those areas of Britain, because he'll eventually, by the end of the war, he'll pretty much take over. And the new Model Army fought with a combination of like cavalry, which was armored, like the Ironsides, which is usually one word, which led by Cromwell. Armies were also starting to use muskets, which I think at that time they had the matchlock type musket, which was not very reliable because when it rained, it caused the fuse to go out. So they relied more on later muskets that were more famous, like the wheel-lock. And I think they had early versions of the flintlock musket that were starting to come in as well. They also had heavy infantry that used pikes or long spears. That was something that was used as well, which was, I think, mostly used to help defend cavalry in battle and stuff like that. Now, I will have a video later. I do want y'all to watch, of course, which I just posted there in quizzes. Of course, the most strategic battle, which that video is about, is the Battle of Naseby. Naseby took place in June of 1645, north of London, in a county called Northamptonshire County. And basically on one side, the parliamentarian forces, so-called New Model Army, which was led by Sir Thomas Fairfax and Oliver Cromwell. They fought against, of course, Charles I Royalist Army. And a lot of these battles were not that big. They had one in 1644, I think, which was the Battle of Marston Moor, which had like 40-something thousand troops. This would only probably have like 20, 25,000 troops actually fought in the battle. So it wasn't a real big battle, but it was considered the most strategic because the fact that Fairfax and Cromwell's armies basically just crushed Charles's armies. The Royalist army got badly beaten. About 70-80% of their force was wiped out in the battle. So you'll see in the battle that the Royalist side never really recovered, from the actual battle itself afterwards. And what's going to eventually happen is that Charles and, of course, the Cavalier Royalist side, they're eventually going to be defeated, is what's going to happen. By 1647, Charles gets captured, of course, although he did escape, believe it or not. It was a case where they, I think, imprisoned Charles at one point, but he escaped to Scotland, thinking he could get help up there. And it led to a second English Civil War, which happened mostly in 1648. So basically, Cromwell had to go chase him down again and capture him twice, Charles I. What happened after that, Cromwell then took over basically Parliament, and he purged any kind of members that were against accusing Charles of high treason. And so if you know what happened, eventually they decided to put Charles on trial for high treason. And in the trial, Charles said that basically they had no right to put him on trial for treason because he believed that he should be in power because of divine right theory, basically, which is something he believed in. And of course, it didn't help him. Most of the members of Parliament were pro-Puritan, New Model Army. And so they voted to execute Charles, pretty much a majority. And he was put to death, you can see, on January 30th, 1649. So that officially ended most of the main part of the English Civil War. And like you saw in the little video there, short video, Britain after that kind of becomes like a republic, is what they call it afterwards for like 10, 11 years, where they don't have a monarch for a while. So it's quite surprising, about them executing their king. I don't think England's done that much. I thought there was one a long time ago they may have executed, I think, but the British have not done that, much, execute their monarch or whatever. Of course, the French do it later with the French Revolution in the future, which we'll get to probably next week. Now they had another one. I guess I'll mention briefly. And it's not that as important, but there was a third English Civil War about 1649 to 51. And that one, what happened was Charles I had a son who we'll get to later. Of course, Charles II, that was his name. He declared himself the King of Scotland, also King of England, all that Britain. So that forced Oliver Cromwell to have to go after him as well. So he basically took his forces northward, New Model Army, and they invaded Scotland again, like a second time. Oh, that one. However, Charles II escaped. Wasn't able to capture him, 1651. And so that would kind of later be a problem for the, later. And that allowed Charles II to later be restored to the throne. So he'll come back later, but that'll be like in much 1660, about 9 years later when that happens. And so with the Civil War pretty much over at that point, that then allows, of course, Cromwell and, of course, the Puritans to basically take over the country. There's Cromwell, by the way. You see on the right, a very famous figure, Old Ironsides, or, they also called him Puritan Moses. Cromwell had a very, very famous quote I wanted to relate to you. It's kind of well known. Not sure it was like in a letter or something he wrote, but he said once that I think that he that prays best fights best. Always like that quote. So he really thought that men that were very religious, believed in God, were better at fighting war than men that did not. So I don't know. But he's a very religious guy. And of course, later after he takes over, he's going to try to, force Puritanism, very religious, principles, of course, in England and Britain, and talk about what happened afterwards. Now, of course, what occurs afterwards, after Cromwell comes in, he then starts this new period in British history they call the Commonwealth, which is called sometimes the Commonwealth of England or Commonwealth of Britain. Either one is fine. They call it all kinds of names. They call it the Protectorate, I think is another name that they sometimes call it. The Interregnum, I think is another name they call it as well. And within a few years, Cromwell puts himself up as like a head of state, which was not more like a Republican type government, but more like a military style dictatorship run by him in pretty much the New Model Army. And so Cromwell would be kind of like a dictator for like 5, 6, 7 years, roughly. He has the title of Lord Protector for about 5, 6 years. From about 1653 to about 1658, he's given that title, which he reigns by. I think they also called him Head of State, was another title that he went by. And at one point, I believe like they were saying in the video, that little short video I showed you, they were calling him Royal Highness, just about Your Highness. I think he was almost like a king, King Oliver, almost in name, but he could have been king, but he evidently didn't want to do it. Didn't. I think he pretty much just wanted to do away with the monarchy, not have one, and all of that. Then, of course, Cromwell was also well known, like we talked about, saw a little video about how they tried to push Puritanism on everybody, on the population, England, etc., Scotland, I guess, and all of that. So that led to strict religious laws. You couldn't do certain things on Sunday, Like I know like in later times, they'll have what they call blue laws you may have heard of, where you can't drink alcohol on Sunday or buy alcohol, and things like that. You got to go to church, and things like that. Close pubs, theaters, house of prostitution, etc. So all this kind of things that they pushed on people. And so people hated, Puritanism. They didn't like it at all. This is kind of what's going on. Like in like the New World later with Massachusetts, you'll see like in early America, colonial America, they have, of course, the same thing happen as well. A lot of the Puritans actually fled and went to America after they got kicked out. Oh, one more thing I will mention about Cromwell, which is well known. Part of the Third English Civil War was that Cromwell's forces went into Ireland to subjugate that area, to make it part of the Commonwealth as well. Cromwell is notorious for committing genocide in Ireland. He sacked several Irish cities, Drogheda, Wexford. In fact, Drogheda, they think he may have killed like 9,000 people, like men, women, and children, just massacred them. And so Cromwell got a really bad name because of that. And that dragged on for several years, where Ireland fought his forces to prevent him from taking it over. And it may have resulted in, they think, 500,000 or more Irish people being killed. And so you go to Ireland today, the Irish still hate Cromwell. They can't stand the guy. I think he's one of their most hated men that they ever had to deal with, and all that. So something that he is, famous for, Cromwell and all that. There's another slide, too, if you want to look at later about the Commonwealth and life under Cromwell. But yeah, there was a lot of punishment, if you didn't follow certain laws, and if you didn't go to church, they would fine you or imprison you and things like that. So even banned sports and things like that. Wow. So it's kind of like now with the virus going on, trying to ban certain things from people doing stuff. So it's kind of like a similar to that, huh? Right, yeah, let me get into also, of course. Now, he had a son, of course, the video kind of briefly talked about. They didn't really tell him his name, but, of course, that is Richard Cromwell. Richard Cromwell, well, what happened with Oliver Cromwell, he died of natural causes. And so Cromwell came in. He only reigned about 9 months from 1658 to 59. So Oliver Cromwell's son, Richard, was briefly Lord Protector, too. Less than a year. And of course, he reigned originally with the military's consent. But within so many, months after he came in, they realized he wasn't as strong as a ruler as his father was, Oliver Cromwell. So eventually what happened was he got deposed. They overthrew him in a coup in 1659. And so later the people that were the so-called royalists who didn't really like him and Cromwell and all that, later gave him nicknames such as Tumbledown Dick and Queen Dick, they called him. Which I don't know if you know, back in the old days, if you were a male monarch and you were kind of seen as weak, they'd call you a queen, that kind of thing. Then Dick is just the nickname for Richard, So that's basically what happened with that. So Richard, got overthrown. And so that was the end of the Cromwells. Oh, by the way, the English were so angry about the Cromwells reigning, if you know about this, that they actually dug up Cromwell's body after he was already dead, and they dragged him through the streets. Yeah, I think they actually took him and they hung him, even though he's dead. Kind of a terrible story about that. But the Cromwell, like Oliver Cromwell, was a very famous individual in English history. I think he's considered one of the most famous politicians in British history, up there with Winston Churchill, but he's obviously kind of controversial and all that. All right, so that's enough about what happened to, of course, the Cromwells. So they go out of power, and so that pretty much eventually by 1660, that'll end the period, the interregnum period. And so you have another period that comes in where you got the restoration of the Stuarts following. So the Stuarts come in. They're actually brought back in by the British. They, of course, sick of the what happened with Cromwell and all that. So they have what they call the Convention Parliament that met in 1660. And so they decide to restore the Stuart dynasty. They call it the Restoration, is one of the nicknames of it. They usually call it the Restoration of the Stuart dynasty. And who do they crown? They crown Charles II, son of Charles I. He's brought in. Charles II had been in exile for years, like in France and other countries. And he was eventually restored and crowned on the date of May 29th, 1660, which, by the way, was also his birthday as well. And, of course, later I think the British called that Restoration Day. They also have another nickname they call it, which is either called Oak Apple Day or Royal Oak Day. And there's a story, I don't know if you have heard of this before, but the story where in the not third, yeah, Third English Civil War, where Cromwell and Scotland tried to capture Charles, who was Charles II later. And if you know about it, he escaped from Cromwell's grasp by hiding in a oak tree. It was a royal oak tree, apparently. And so hence they sometimes call it Royal Oak Day or Oak Apple Day. And that's where the name came from. So yeah, Charles would come in, and Charles, of course, had a nickname. He was called the Merry Monarch. Now, there's different reasons why he was called the Merry Monarch. One is because the period under the Stuarts, when they come in, was more of a happier period. So people start, get rid of all the puritanical stuff that the Puritans have been doing. And so after that, things in England became more maybe liberal, if you want to call it that. So it's a happier period, restoration of the Stuarts. Charles II was a very popular ruler, by the way. Charles was also known for his loose court, which is true. A lot of hanky-panky going on. Apparently, Charles II was notorious for having a lot of mistresses, up to 14 mistresses. That's a lot that he had. It was quite common in those days for monarchs to have a lot of mistresses. He was married to this woman named Catherine of Braganza, who was Portuguese Catholic, which was kind of controversial because there was debate about whether he was pro-Catholic or not. And he never had any legitimate children with her. I think they had children, but they died. And he had all these illegitimate children he had with all these mistresses, like at least 11 he may have had that were illegitimate. And so because of that, later, Charles would end up having to give the throne to his brother, James, who was known as the Duke of York. He later called James II. And James became controversial because he converted to Catholicism. It was kind of a problem, so that kind of deal. So, but like I said, Charles was very popular, even though there was a lot of this pro-Catholic sentiment. Some people think that Charles II was secretly Catholic, that he may have converted either during his reign or his deathbed. It's kind of been debate about that. But I know his brother, James II, Duke of York, he was really controversial because in 1660s, he converted to Catholicism. Yeah. So anyway, talk about a few things that I did want to mention about. Now, because of all this pro-Catholic sentiment that was going on with the Stuart dynasty, there was this deal where Parliament passed what they call the Test Act. I don't know if you've ever heard of that, what a Test Act is, basically. But a Test Act was like a deal where you had to take an oath that you weren't Catholic. Like, say, if you wanted to be in the military or be in the actual British government. So you had to basically state that you weren't Catholic and take an oath that you were Protestant, Anglican probably, or whatever. And so they were trying to do this because they were really concerned about, I think, Charles II's brother who had converted to Catholicism. I think there was attempts to actually prevent him from becoming king. They didn't want him to become king because he was Catholic. So that was a big, big problem, of course, that they had during his reign. Let me talk about a few things, of course, that happened under Charles' reign. Of course, there's a picture there of Charles II on the right, which you're looking at over here. Now, under Charles II, they had a bunch of major events that happened under his reign. I do want to get into. Some are very famous. One of the most famous events that happened under his reign was in 1666. You had the Great Fire of London occurred. Great Fire of London was this massive fire, which happened in September of 1666, which burned down a good bit of most of the old London that went back to Roman times. It lasted over a period of 4 days, September 2nd to September 5th, 1666. And the fire itself burned down, they believe, I got an approximate number more or less, but it actually burned down over 13 something thousand houses and buildings, were burned in the fire. Actually, what's interesting about it, I always laugh about, it burned down like something like 87 churches got burned down. I think it was one was some cathedral burned down. I forget which one it was, but it was, which one was that? The cathedral that burned down. But yeah, all these churches burned, which I always joke about that year, 1666. You get 666. I don't know if you see that or not. 666, but 66 is the mark of the number of the beast, Satan or whatever. Kind of weird about that. But it did destroy a lot of the main palaces of the royal family, like around where Whitehall is, which is like a road and area in England where you have like, Buckingham Palace built later there. But the weird thing about the fire was that they're not sure about the death toll. They've never been able to figure that out, like how many people actually died from the fire, which could have been a lot of people because it was just so vast of a range of fire that broke out. But those numbers are unknown because of records not kept about it. The death, so they don't know about that. Also, they think the fire was an accident. Apparently, the fire broke out in, I think, what was one of the King's Bakery on what is a famous street in London called Pudding Lane. So that's where it started. And there was actually this guy, it was a French guy named, I think his name was Hubert. I think his name, Richard Hubert, I think his name was. He claimed he started the fire because he was pro-Catholic, but they now think that it was just a total accident, the actual fire. So, but the Great Fire of London is like one of like the two worst disasters to hit, London. The other one, of course, was the Blitz. Hitler, when he attacked, England during World War II, starting with the Battle of Britain, and that totally devastated, cities like London, etc. Killed a lot of people, of course, during World War II. Another major event that happened under his reign too, Charles II, they had the so-called Great Plague of London. Happened around the same time, 1665 to 1666. If you know about that, that was a major outbreak of the bubonic plague, which has been around forever. And the bubonic plague was a type of plague that was spread by rats, usually by the rat flea. And apparently it killed like 100,000 or more people in London and parts of England. It was considered one of the last major outbreaks of bubonic plague in Europe, even though it's kind of probably up to around, I want to say the 1800s is around overall. And they believe the plague was caused by this plague bacillum or bacterium that was carried by rat fleas. Yersinia pestis, I think it's called, which they didn't find out about the plague, really like what caused it until the late 19th century. It's a little later when they figured it out. And eventually at modern times, they later called the bubonic plague, it was later called the Black Death or the Black Plague due to the symptoms of it and also the amount of people that died from it, which one point, over time in history, there may have been millions that have died of it. If you know about the story about the 14th century, that was the worst period of the Black Death when it killed millions throughout Europe. So they think that up to modern times that the bubonic plague may have killed as many as, 100 million people in the world. So it was definitely one of the most deadly plagues in history. And I think the other big one was the Spanish flu that happened about 100 years ago around World War I. It killed probably 50 million. So like the coronavirus is bad, but it's nothing near those two plagues that happened overall. There's one thing that's not in the study guide, but I wanted to mention, which happened under Charles II, which is well known. I'll talk about a few minutes on it, but they had these plots, assassination plots, where they tried to kill Charles II and also his brother, James. There was one called the Popish plot, which happened in 16 78 was the year. And there was this guy going around named Titus Oates. They called him the Titus Oates, Titus the Liar, I think they called him. He started making up this conspiracy that there were Catholics and I think Jesuits that were conspiring to kill Charles II and his brother James. And it led to a lot of paranoia that there were Catholics everywhere. I think some Catholics were even killed because of it. And so Oates and a bunch of other Catholics were rounded up. They were eventually executed. So it may have been some kind of plot. They don't know how serious it was. But it led to what they call the Exclusion Bill later in Parliament, which happened right after. And there was attempts by Parliament to pass some kind of act that would prevent Charles II's brother from getting the throne, James, the Duke of York, because he was Catholic. So it was a big thing to try to stop him, but they couldn't do it. Then we have this other plot called the Rye House Plot, 1683. It was another anti-Catholic plot to try to murder, not just murder Charles II, but his brother James. And it actually involved members of Parliament, they found out later. They were actually in a cabal trying to take out both of them, but they never were able to get it done. They weren't in the right spot to try to attack them or something like that. And so it never came to fruition, but some of the members were actually arrested. They found out about the plot later and they're actually executed for it, which were members of Parliament. So that's basically talking about Charles II's reign. So yeah, he was a popular, monarch, but they had all these problems where, people thought they were pro-Catholic and all that. Then they, of course, had James II, who came in, of course, next. And, of course, James II reigned from 1685 to 1688. Of course, he's known for several things. He's known, of course, being the last Catholic monarch that the British will have. Of course, they'll ban those, of course, later. I've told you that James II was the brother of Charles II. He was known as the Duke of York. Now, I don't know if you have heard about this before, but at one point, James, the Duke of York, actually owned where New York is, like in the United States. So he actually was control that colony at one point. I think he owned New Jersey too, like there, because I think New Jersey and New York were actually one colony at one point, but they split it. But the name of New York City, is pretty much named after him, the Duke of York. Most people don't know that. That's where the name came from. Now, James II, of course, we're talking about him. As being the last, Catholic monarch that they have. James had a lot of conflicts with Parliament, several reasons, at least two main things. One, he was, of course, pro-Catholic. So they thought he had support from like Louis XIV in France, who he was related to, by the way. I think he was like I want to say a nephew of Louis XIV. I think that's correct. And then also, James was also pro-divine right as well. So he was kind of in favor of the king having more power and all that. And so what happens later, it leads to him getting overthrown by Parliament. Parliament doesn't want these Catholic rulers in power. And at first it was okay because he had his first wife, Anne Hyde, who had died in 1671, had two Protestant children that were daughters, one named Mary, later called Mary II, and then, of course, also Anne, later called Queen Anne. Yeah, Mary II was Queen Mary, they called her, Queen Mary II, and Anne is Queen Anne. So those are both, sisters of each other, and so it looks like one of those, could get the throne and all that. However, what happened was James remarried, which I think was in 1673 when he remarried. And he married this woman named Mary of Modena, who also went by the name Mary Beatrice. She was from Italy. She was Catholic. He had already converted to Catholicism, they think, in the 1660s. And so what happened to cause all the problems was that he had a son that was born with her in June of 1688, who became known as James Francis Edward Stuart. they later call the so-called Old Pretender or James III. And so this creates a tizzy, in Parliament. Now we got this, new son he's got. He can give the throne to him instead of the two daughters and all of that. The throne usually goes to the male first, then the females. So Parliament decides at that point, we're not going to have any of that. And so several members of Parliament all get together and they decide to back instead for the throne William of Orange, who was James II's nephew. And then he had a wife, of course, he was married to, which was Mary, who we just talked about. Mary, of course, is the daughter of James II. That's kind of weird. They're cousins, first cousins married to each other. William and Mary, as they're called later. And so what happens was a bunch of members of Parliament write a letter to William of Orange saying, hey, you can come over and take the throne and we won't stop you. And so this letter was referred to as being called the Immortal Seven, or also called the Invitation to William letter. And I think he got it like that fall. I think it was like that fall when he got the letter. And he decided to agree to it, that he would come over with his own army and he would seize power. So what happens next, November 1688, William of Orange crosses the English Channel. Nobody's really been able to successfully invade and come into England since, I guess, William the Conqueror, And so when he arrives in England, the English accept him as their new monarch. And it forces James to flee the country because the military and the Parliament won't support him as king anymore. And so there's this bloodless transfer of power between William and James. And it's like a bloodless coup. And so the English later call it the Glorious Revolution because of the fact that the power was exchanged without too much, conflict, between both sides. And so you're going to see later that it's going to lead to a lot of political changes in Britain. It's going to eventually get rid of the absolute monarchy, and they're going to eventually go to more of a constitutional monarchy, which is what's going to eventually happen. So what is going to happen next after that is that William and Mary, so you have a little slide here if you want to look at, of course, on William. William and Mary are going to, of course, come in at that point. And yeah, they do actually rule together as joint rulers. So they're joint monarchs together as so-called William and Mary. You may have heard of the college, right? William and Mary, which is in Virginia, just kind of named after him. Now, which they help establish, by the way, in the New World. I believe it's got named after him and all of that. And of course, they don't really become joint rulers, if you know about this, and become the monarchs until they accept the Bill of Rights, which is adopted by Parliament in 1689. So they don't actually become the rulers till 1689 overall. And before I get to that, I did want to mention something briefly. I think it's in the study guide, but I wouldn't worry about it. I don't think it's something I'm really going to cover. But I think there's a question in there I did want to mention about that went back to James real quick. Let me go back to him, but I'll just kind of give it to you so you'll know it. But there's a movement that's later called, it's called the Jacobitism movement or the Jacobite movement. I'll just mention briefly about it. But after James got ousted and William and Mary came in, took over, there were like pro-Catholic Stuarts that were in Britain and other countries that wanted to put James back on the throne, James II, and all of his relatives. And so you get conflicts afterwards because of that. Like England went through a period called the War of the English Succession. You may have heard of that, broke out right after because of this. And King Louis XIV even tried to support James II to put him back on the throne. But long term, it failed between the 17th and the 18th centuries. And they even had, I think, his son I mentioned, which was James Francis Edward Stuart. They called the Old Pretender. He tried to get the throne back too. He failed as well. And I think James Francis Edward Stuart had a son named Charles Francis Edward Stuart. It's kind of difficult to get those who they called the Young Pretender. They also called him Bonnie Prince Charlie as well. He tried to get the throne back too, but it failed. And England went through the so-called Jacobite rebellions, they sometimes called it, where these pro-Catholic, Stuarts wanted to put them back on the throne, but it never happened, and all that. So I just kind of wanted to mention about that before I move on, talk about the rest of the Stuart period. So yeah, going back to, of course, the joint monarchs, William and Mary. Now, William and Mary, like I said, they had, like I told you, they had to accept the Bill of Rights. What was the Bill of Rights? It was an act passed by Parliament, 1689. Sometimes called the English Bill of Rights, I think, from our view. But it created a constitutional monarchy, is what it did. So Britain became a constitutional monarchy. Basically, the monarch or monarchs became limited. They had limited powers. And eventually, by the 1800s, the British monarch becomes really a figurehead, with Parliament and the Prime Minister having most of the power over time. So they kind of go away from what the French are doing, like with absolutism, and they go to a constitutional monarchy. Also, the Act as well, Bill of Rights, adopted basic rights for all Englishmen. So that's another thing it did too as well. Second thing. And the third thing it did was it banned Catholic rulers on the throne. So they can no longer have rulers like James II anymore. You have to be Protestant, preferably Anglican. By the way, these are like some of the basic rights that were in the Bill of Rights, which I want to mention. Here's some stuff, very interesting stuff in here. Basic rights, of course, all a parliament can create laws or taxation. So the king or monarch cannot do any of that. They can't create their own laws. They can't create their own taxes, revenue, can't collect revenue. So only the people can do that, Parliament. People have a right to free speech. So they have that in the Bill of Rights. People have a right to petition the government, the king, the monarch, without being imprisoned or whatever. No quartering of troops in peacetime. Of course, they would kind of break that, if you know about that, in America, sort of, which caused the American Revolution. You know about that. It's a little later. No posting excessive bail was another thing, of course, as well with the court system. Also, another basic rights. No imprisonment without charge. They cannot suspend your habeas corpus rights, stuff like that. The monarchy must follow the rule of law. So they had all these laws. King isn't above it, that kind of thing. Also, everyone has a right to trial by jury. That was another thing they put in there, which kind of, I think, goes back to the Magna Carta and all that. So Bill of Rights was pretty important document that they passed. If you know much about it, it heavily influenced the United States. Like, our government, put a lot of these ideas into the U.S. Constitution, like the first 10, amendments to the Constitution, often called the Bill of Rights. Of course, ours are basically kind of influenced by a lot of these ideas that were in the English Bill of Rights. So very, very highly influential what happened with that. Also, I mentioned this before probably already, but the Bill of Rights was heavily influenced by John Locke. Of course, that English philosopher, political theorist I mentioned about before. Locke actually published this series of essays called Two Treatises of Government, actually published it in 1689 anonymously, believe it or not at first. And then I guess after what happened with this, being real successful, he put his name on it. Say, hey, it's me that did it, that kind of thing. And John Locke, of course, a lot of his ideas actually went into the Bill of Rights. And of course, his ideas, influenced later, like American government, Declaration of Independence, and those ideas that we have, of course, over here. All right, a few more minutes. Let me also talk about the last monarch they had of the Stuarts. And of course, that, was Queen Anne. I wanted to talk a few minutes on her a little bit. Queen Anne, like I said, was the last Stuart monarch. So she would reign from 1702 to 1714. She, of course, like I said, was the sister of Mary II, Queen Mary II. And she came to the throne after Mary and William died in that order. The only thing about Queen Anne was that she didn't have any heirs that could take the throne. In fact, she was pregnant. You can see she's pregnant 17 times, and all the children died. It's really a tragic story about Queen Anne. She's a pretty lady. Look at her in that picture. And so what happened was the Parliament had to make a decision right before she came in. They knew she wasn't going to have any more children, I guess. So the Parliament decided to pass what is called the Act of Settlement. Came out in 1701. What it did was it gave the throne to what is the House of Hanover, the so-called Hanover dynasty or Hanoverian dynasty. And these were German cousins that were related back to King James I. And they would give the throne to one of their cousins who was named George of Hanover, who was like a prince, basically, ruling. I think he was called the Elector of Hanover. He would later come over, 1714, when Anne would die. He would become known as King George I, part of the so-called four main Georges, I guess, that would be be king of Britain later. And so that's one thing that happened, where the Stuarts went out, and of course, the Hanover dynasty came in. So, and by the way, all those, I'll get to it later, but all those Catholic Stuarts who could have gotten the throne, they couldn't because of the Bill of Rights, etc. And so I forget how many people were skipped over. I'll talk about it later, but I think it was like 54 people got skipped over for being king or queen, I guess. That could have been the ruler. I think he was the 55th in line, the throne, something like that. It was really weird, bizarre thing that happened with that. Also under Anne, they had this thing called the Acts of Union that came out, 1707, 1708. What that did was these were acts passed by the parliaments of England and Scotland that basically unified England and Scotland as one kingdom, the so-called United Kingdom that King James I had started a long time ago when he came king in 1603. So that made it official, basically, is what it did. Which a few years ago, Scotland tried to vote to leave the unification there, but it failed. And so they're still together, And so United Kingdom is going to include later England, which is incorporated Wales, Scotland, and then now Northern Ireland. But at the time, it was Ireland that, of course, was part of it. What's going to happen is the British will develop a flag to represent that, which is the so-called Union Jack flag, which you can see there in the evolution of it over time. And basically, it's a combination of three flags that will be merged together over time. You've got the St. George's Cross, which is the flag of England. It's right here. You got the St. Andrew's Cross, which is the flag of Scotland. So at first they would merge that together in the 18th century, and that's the flag they had originally. Then in the 1800s, they adopted the St. Patrick's Cross, which is the flag of Ireland. And so that became the flag that they have today, that they still use. They still have the St. Patrick's Cross in it, but it only represents, I guess, Northern Ireland, because Ireland later in the early 20th century broke away and formed their own separate state, Republic of Ireland, that they have now. So that's kind of a little history, of like what happened between the Stuart period. Now, later, I won't talk about it now, but I'll get into later. I don't think we're going to have time. I don't think I'm going to do it today because I'm not going to have time to really finish it up. But I will talk more into the rise of the British Empire. So I'm going to get into talk about the last two dynasties. Of course, they have what the British House of Hanover and, of course, the House of Windsor, which was originally called Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. So I'll get more into that later next week. And then I am going to start next week, probably next Tuesday, talking about the French Revolutionary period that occurs in France. So we'll get into that. And then if I have any time next week, we'll see how it goes. We may even start talking about Napoleon, Age of Napoleon and all that. So that's pretty much it for today, lecture-wise. Now, I did want to remind you before I go, remember Thursday, Friday this week, we don't have classes. We have fall break. So anyway, just want to remind you about that. There were some assignments I told you about. And of course, I'd remind you about, like the one this week. I know the one that's on the scientific revolution, right? In the Age of Enlightenment. So try to get that done if you haven't done it yet. Now, I did put a new one up. You saw that one, which is on the Battle of Naseby, that video assignment that you need to do. So try to get that done. Because that might be able to count, that especially that last video quiz as towards your, midterm grade and all that. So that's pretty much it. I will later have this, video up, like I said, on my YouTube channel after I finish. So if anybody's got any questions about anything, let me know. Don't like anybody has any questions now, I guess, for me today. You can always just send me a comment through my YouTube channel, or you can you can email me too if you want as well. So I don't think I have any more things to say right now. I don't know if y'all had any questions that are on there right now, but if not, that's about it. So y'all take care. Looks like we got a storm out there, like maybe hurricane might be coming through the Gulf. So I have to watch that and see what happens with that. So that's kind of concerning about that. So I think it's supposed to hit the northern part of the Gulf Coast. So that's it for today. Y'all take care and have a good fall break coming up. Of course, we'll, of course, have another lectures up, of course, next week. So y'all take care. Okay.